Hello, my name is John Matthew Rasil, and I am in 10th grade, and I attend the bilingual specialized school by Rufo in Puerto Rico. And today I'll be presenting my project that is about the African Americans who immigrated to the USSR. Now let's get started. Now, I'll say the historical background of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, lasting from the stock market crash of 1929 to 1939. The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrial world, like I said, lasting from 1929 to 1939. It began after the stock market crash of October of 1929, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. Over the next several years, consumer spending and investment dropped, causing step declines in industrial output and employment as falling companies laid off workers. By 1933, when the Great Depression reached its lowest point, some 50 million Americans were unemployed and nearly half the country's banks had failed. Throughout the reason that it happened is throughout the 1920s, the U.S. economy expanded rapidly, and the nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, appeared dubbed the Roaring Twenties. Now, let's go to the Jim Crow laws. Now, the Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation named after a black minstrel show character. The last, excuse me, the laws, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968, were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. Those who attempt to defy Jim Crow laws were often arrested, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. Now, there were some black codes. Now, the roots of Jim Crow laws began as early 1865, immediately after following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. The Black Codes were strict local and state laws that detail when, where, and how formerly enslaved people could work, and for how much compensation. The codes appeared throughout the South as a legal way to put Black citizens into indentured servitude, to take voting rights away, to control where they live and how they travel, and to seize children for labor purposes. The legal system was stacked against Black citizens with former soldiers working as police and judges, making it difficult for African Americans to win court cases and ensuring they were subject to Black codes. Those Black codes work in conjunction with labor camps for the incarcerated, where prisoners were treated as enslaved people. Black offenders typically received longer sentences than their white equals, and because of the grueling work, often did not live out their entire sentence. So it was basically slavery, like, you know. Now let's go to the USSR. Okay. Science and technology in the Soviet Union serve as an important part of national politics, practices, and identity. From the time of Lenin until the dissolution of the USSR in the early 1990s, both science and technology were intimately linked to the ideology and practical functioning of the Soviet state, and were pursued along paths both similar and distinct from models in other countries. Many great scientists who work in Imperial Russia, such as a name that I cannot pronounce, continued to work in the USSR and gave birth to Soviet science. The governments made the development and advancement of science a national priority, they emphasized science at all levels of education and showered top scientists with honors. Very large numbers of engineers graduated every year. Soviet scientists whom acclaim in several fields. marked by a highly developed pure science and innovation at the theoretical level throughout interpretation and application fell short. They were at the cutting edge of science in fields such as mathematics and in several branches of physical science, notably theoretically nuclear physics, chemistry, and astronomy. The physical chemist and physics, another word that I can't pronounce, that I couldn't remember how to pronounce, was the first. That person was the first Soviet citizen to win a Nobel Prize in 1956, among several other Soviet Nobel Prizes winners. And the mathematician Sergei Novikov was the first Soviet citizen to win a field medal in 1970, followed by Gregory Margulis in 1978. Now, the Soviet technology was most highly developed in the fields of nuclear physics, where the arms race with the West convinced policy markers to set aside sufficient resources for research. Due to a crash program directed by Igor Kovacsy based on speeds of Cambridge 5, the Soviet Union was the second nation to develop an atomic bomb in 1945. 4 years later, after the United States, the Soviet Union detonated a hydrogen bomb in 1953, a mere 10 months after the United States space exploration was also highly developed. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched their first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit. In April 1961, a Soviet cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, became the first man in space. The Soviets maintained a strong space program until economic problems led to cutbacks in 1980s. Although the sciences were less rigorously censored than other fields such as art, there were several examples of suppression of ideas. In the most notorious arguments, Trofim Linesco, that was a scientist who refused to accept the chromosome theory of every use usually accepted by modern genetics, claiming his theories corresponded to Marxism. He managed to talk Joseph Stalin in 1948 into banning the practice of teaching population genetics and several other related fields of biological research. This decision was only reversed in the 1960s. So I already covered the USSR and the Soviet experiences and why the USSR recruited experts. Now, if we see the image in the computer, we're going to talk about John Oliver Golden. John Oliver Golden, who was born in 1887 in Yasu County, Mississippi, was the son of former slaves who prospered during Reconstruction. Their house, however, was burned twice by the Ku Klux Klan, which resented the family's success, and they were forced to leave Mississippi for Alabama, while Oliver was a student at Kutztoy Institute. One of Golden's professors at Tuskegee was George Washington Carver, which whom he kept in contact with throughout his life. Golden did not graduate Tuskegee University because he was drafted into the U.S. Army to fight in France during the World War One. After the war, he worked as a waiter in a railroad dining car in Chicago, Illinois, and in the early 1920s joined the Chicago labor movement and later the U.S. Communist Party. Oliver was fascinated with the anti-racist ideology of communism, and he decided to come to the Soviet Russia in 1924 by an invitation from a friend who held a high post in Comintern, the international organization that promoted war communism. Oliver arrived in Russia with his first wife, Jane Wilson, but she fell ill and died the same year. Oliver fell into a depression but was nursed back to health by a Soviet Asian woman, Anja, whose name was Anja, with whom he fell in love. The couple never married, but they had a child, Olava Gold. Oliver enrolled in the prestigious Communist University for Oriental Workers in Moscow, which recruited revolutionaries from Asia and Africa. Oliver received his degree in early 1938 and returned to the United States where he worked for the American Communist Party. He met his second wife, Berta Bialik, in prison after both of them were arrested at a political demonstration. Berta Beilig was born in Poland to a Jewish family and moved to the United States where her parents, which I said, where her parents, both the African American and Jewish communities, were opposed to a rational marriage, but Berta and Oliver decided to get married to challenge this belief. In the 1930, approximately 2,000 American engineers were sent to the Soviet Union to help reward its warage economy. Oliver decided to take advantage of this opportunity, but found that of the specialists sent to the Soviet Union by 50 United States companies, no African American were included. Oliver enlisted the help of George Washington Carver to organize a team of African American agronomists who would travel to the Soviet Union. In 1931, Oliver left the United States with 14 other African American cotton specialists from various universities and his wife Berta Violet. They were invited by the Soviet government to serve as experts in the cultivation of cotton. They chose to come to Osibek because it was a cotton-growing region and because it was the Soviet Republic of National Minorities, because Uzbeks has faced discrimination in terrorist Russia because of their skin color. After settling in Janjuga village near Trashpan, Golden gave lectures on cotton civil cultivation and helped develop a type of hydrated cotton that will be grown there. He moved to Taskent and was elected to the city council. Local authorities issued him permission to carry a personal revolver, which was an indication of the status of the time. When the Soviet contract for the agronomists ended in 1934, most of the Oliver's group returned to the United States. Oliver and Berta Golden, however, decided to remain and accept Soviet citizenship. Later in his life, Oliver was active in Soviet efforts to promote the Scottsboro Boys, and he taught classes at the Institute of Reclamation while his wife, Berta, taught English classes in the Institute of Foreign Language. Oliver Golden later sadly died in 1940 of a heart failure in Tuscan, and he lived 53 years as of life. Now, let's get to Robert Pattinson. Robert Pattinson, excuse me, Robert Robinson was an engineer who became one of the most prominent Americans to live in the Soviet Union because of his presence in the USSR in the 1930s. Robertson became an international celebrity, meeting often with many famous actors, African Americans who lived in the travel to the Soviet Union. He personally experienced Stalinism and his various political purges as many of his co-workers disappeared without a trace. He also experienced the paradox of Soviet internationalship discourse, which tutored to racial equality against the reality of the Russian people, virulent racism against all non-Russian people, especially those of African origin. He was born in Kingston in Jamaica in 1906. Robinson and his Dominican mother, Octavia, live in Cuba, where she worked for Physician, and Robinson trained in Cuba as a mechanical engineer before immigrating to the United States in 1930. He settled in Dearborn, Michigan, where he worked as one of a handful of black mechanicists at the Ford Motor plant in the city. That same year, Soviet delegation visiting the plant to study Ford assembly line production techniques offered Robinson a higher salary, better living accommodations, and other perquisites to move in Stalingrad and work in a tractor factory. Robinson accepted the offer, returning only once in 1933 to visit his mother in New York. In 1934, Robinson was elected as a representative to the Moscow Soviet City Council. This election prompted many observers to conclude that he was a communist, leading American officials in Moscow to demand in his immediate return to the United States. Robinson instead made arrogant arrangements to become a Soviet citizen and remained in the Soviet Union to complete his contract. During this time, he was also attending classes at Moscow Evening Institute of Medical Engineering. During his 44 years in the Soviet Union, Robert Robinson survived Stalinism and the German invasion and experienced the first decades of the Cold War. He had attempted to leave the Soviet Union numerous times before finally being allowed to travel to Uganda in 1974. There he married Sibley Mapp. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, an American working in the country as an educator. Robinson and finally Robinson finally returned to the United States in 1978. Now let's get to Waylon Rudd. Waylon Rudd was an American-born actor who moved to the Soviet Union in 1932 as part of a group of 22 African Americans called the Black and White Film Club. Before moving to the Soviet Union, Rudd gained recognition for his roles in The Imperial Jones and Othello and appeared in a number of Broadway productions. Rudd, born in Lincoln, Nebraska in the 1990s, moved to the Soviet Union to escape the restricted Jim Crow laws and racism of the United States that were holding him back from advancing his career. Rudd originally traveled to the Soviet Union to participate in a film by German director Carl Junges, but when that project was canceled, Rudd remained in Russia, where he married a white woman, Latina Mercedes, whom he knew from the United States. They had one child, Lolita. In 1934, Rudd returned to the United States with his wife and child, only to return to Russia 2 years later alone. Rudd again expressed his frustrations with the lack of opportunity in the US and looked forward to returning to the liberated theater of the Soviet Union. Rudd denounced his US citizenship, remarried a Russian woman, had two more children, Victoria and Wayland Jr., and would never return to the United States again. Rudd worked in the Russian theater throughout the 1930s and the 1940s, where he acted in the plays Deep Are the Roots, The Prelude, and The List of Benefits. Rudd also graduated from the prestigious Russian school Theatrical Art Institute in Moscow and studied directing at the State Institute of Theater Arts. Rudd was a member of the well-known Mayer Old Theater and the famous Stanislavski. Sorry, it was an opera and a drama theater. In 1933, he acted in Lou Kozlow's film The Great Comforter and wrote and directed his own plays, including Andy Jones. After the German invasion of Russia in 1941, Rudd performed at the Russian front towards the end of his life. Rudd headed a drama company, directed plays, and frequently gave lectures on racism in the United States. Rudd was also the first black actor to play Othello in Russian. As a result, he gained much admiration throughout the Soviet Union because he was one of the few black actors who would perform their parts in Russian. Rudd passed away from I'm sorry, I don't know, I can't pronounce this right, appendicitis on July 4th, 1952. Now, let's talk about the Homer Smith Jr. Homer Smith Jr., best known for his 14-year sojourn in the Soviet Union, was born in 1909 in Quitman, Mississippi, to parent Mr. and Mrs. Homer Smith. In 1916, at the age of 7, he moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota with his parents between 1922 and 1928. Smith studied journalism at the University of Minnesota. His United States Post Office wages paid his university fees and living accommodations. Witnessing racial discrimination at the university, along with the Scarborough Boys cases and two lynchings of black citizens in the United States in 1931. Smith decided to immigrate to the Soviet Union in 1932 because the U.S. Communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, proclaimed it the one political state which stood for social justice for all oppressed people. Smith applied for a position at the Moscow post office and was hired with a higher salary than his Minneapolis post. He arrived in Russia in 1932 at the beginning of Stalin's second five-year plan. Smith witnessed endemic poverty and hunger. He also became involved with a Metropolitan Film Corporation of Moscow, which created a film script titled Black and White, whose political aim was to document how the capitalist system in the United States oppresses colored citizens. The film company recruited Negroes actors, including Langston Hughes, Lauren Miller, Wayland Rudd, and Dorothy West. They sailed from New York onto Europa sorry, Europe in June 1932. Russian authorities, however, dropped the project when the US recognized the Soviet Union in 1933, and most of the actors returned to the United States. Homer Smith, however, remained and in January 1938, sorry for the mispronunciation, he married Mary Prototska, a Soviet citizen. Smith had been sending articles to black American newspapers since 1932 while he worked at the Moscow post office when Germany invaded Russia in the summer of 1941. He was now a full-time war correspondent for the Associated Negro Press, and in 1944 he became half of two-person Associated Press team in Moscow. As a correspondent, Smith covered the initial German invasion of the Soviet Union, the siege of Moscow, the devastation of Sevastopol in the Crimea, and the excavation of deceased Polish army officers in the Katyn forest in Poland. Smith also reported on his 1945 visit to Nazi extermination camp in Matenwitz, in Poland. While the most attention was focused on the U.S. concentration camp victims and survivors, Smith saw the post-mortem photographs of Senglis troops who were corrupted, who were captured by the Germans in 1940, and they defended the Maginot Line in northeastern France. Many of them were transferred to Mastanovich, where they died. While in Moscow, Smith became friends with the Utopian ambassador to the Soviet Union, Black Terra Lawrence Taesas. This friendship enabled Smith to leave Russia in 1946 and attain a position in the Ethiopian government's new agency, which Taesas held. Mary attained an exit visa and joined Smith in Addis Ababa in 1947. There, the couple's two children, son Alex and daughter Tania, were born. After remaining in Ethiopia for 15 years, Smith renounced his Soviet citizenship and returned to the U.S. in 1962. The FBI, as a Cold War necessity, had complied a dossier on Smith and feared he was a foreign agent of the USSR. The Smith family settled in Chicago, Illinois, where he took a more critical measure tone regarding quality of life in Soviet Russia in a series of articles written from Ebony magazine. Those articles and other writing became the basis of the 1964 autobiography Black Man in the Red Russia. Later, and sadly, Homer Smith died in Chicago in 1972 at the age of 63. Additionally, in 2006, the National Association of Black Journalists honored him a presumption by naming him a Legacy Award winner. Now, let's go to the last one. That is Joseph Jethro Rowan. Joseph Rowan was born in 1905 in the town of Kremlin, Westmoreland Country, Virginia. He was the son of John Hampton Rowan and Emily Virginia Griggs, both descendants of long-standing free families of, of color in Westmoreland country. Sorry. One of the 15 children, Joseph grew up in a happy and prosperous farming family. This family were contemporary cousins to a Parnell Rowe grandmother, Susie Joanne Rowe. He became an agronomist and trained at the Virginia State University. And in 1931, Oliver Golden, a agricultural specialist who had studied in Gutsutsky Institute, organized a group of 16 Black Americans of various professional backgrounds to travel to Ethiopian in Soviet Central Asia to develop an experimental cotton plantation. Joseph and his wife, Sadie, Vivian, Rosa Perone, were part of the party. So, literally, it has a lot to do with John Oliver Gordon and Joseph Jerome. Joseph would answer the question of why he left the US and the USSR in a series of interviews between 2010 and 2002. The reasons were entirely rational and not political. The depression in America continued to worsen, and the USSR actually offered better financial prospects. So, in other words, Joseph Jeffros just wanted another life. The depression, the men were paid the equivalent of several $100s a month, a fortune by standards of the Great Depression by his own admission. Joseph didn't even knew what socialism was. There was a well-paid opportunity offered and he took it. Basically, he just went for the money. While Joseph may not have held any political interest, Stalin's Communism Party certainly did. Stalin's Communism Party believed that the blacks, as members of an oppressed social group, would be key participants in the communist revolution at that time. By demonstrating racial tolerance and progressive thinking, the Soviet leaders were enhancing their country's appeal to liberal minded white and black intellectuals around the world. The aim was to secure sympathy of the communist issues. Now, in October 1931, Joseph and Stalin, along their competitors, settled in the tiny village of Jajigul in Sobskenia. Their group's mission was to improve on the social strains of the Surkot. Ron and two other immigrants spent 3 years crossing Uzbek seeds with American seeds and finally produced a new strain of cotton that took 25% less time to mature than cotton in some South. Joseph and Sadie had a son while they were in Subsignia, originally named Joseph, and the Russians found it a curious name choice. So Joseph Jr. was hastily and duly rechristened Joseph Stalin Kim Rome. It was a new name. When the first three year contract expired, all the farmers, including Rome, signed up for another 3 years. He will be reassigned to Georgia to help operate a tomato canning plant. All the members of Golden's group were ordered to adopt Soviet citizenship immediately after who did not were expelled from the Soviet Union. Joseph and Sadie, their 6-year-old son Joseph, returned to the Westmoreland. Little Joseph arrived speaking Russian, the only language that he knew. Apparently, Joseph's classmates were amazed and started to meet a fellow American who only spoke Russian and could not understand a word in English. Basically, all the time he was in Russia, well, that made him Russian, in other words. Joseph balanced farming with social activism. He was invited to be one of the first three teachers at the A.T. Johnson High School, the new and only African American public high school in Westmoreland in 1937. He founded the Virginia Farmers of America program for black high school students. Ron would go on to be a consultant in the Virginia Fisheries Laboratory Forestry Association. He founded the Virginia Colored Farmers Association and was a lifelong member of the NAACP and the Masons. So that will be everything. Now let me show you the bibliography in APA format. So I thank everybody. I thank everybody on this presentation for listening, and I hope you guys have a wonderful and amazing day.